Good afternoon, class. I'll be going over the importance of having a good instruction set architecture. I will not necessarily be going over computer architecture as a whole, and this video will not have any orthodox structure in general, but there are several points that I know have to be covered, and so I will get to those points. This is not comprehensive. It doesn't really cover all the points, but these are points that I thought of. This video and its associated scripts was made purely out of passion. The main goal is to defend and promote the x86 ISA over ARM, but whatever knowledge you get out of this isn't just about that. You can use it for, computer architecture in general or learning about ISAs in general. So, what is an ISA? ISA stands for Instruction Set Architecture. An ISA basically defines a language that a CPU is expected to understand. It doesn't necessarily matter how the CPU was built, who built it, what company was involved, or anything like that. The language consists of a bunch of instructions that are defined in a document of some sort, like a programmer's manual. For both the people who are making a CPU that is trying to follow that ISA, and for people who are trying to make programs for that CPU. So when I say it doesn't matter who built the CPU, I mean like obviously someone has to design an ISA, but if someone else is trying to design a CPU to follow that ISA design, then it doesn't matter who that someone else is. What matters is that the CPU being built is going to match with whatever is in the programmer's manual. For example, Intel releases programmers manuals for their x86 CPUs for anyone to download for free. Yes, free. It is not a secret whatsoever. It is not illegal to own this document. You are practically encouraged to download that document. Every self-respecting ISA, even the likes of ARM, will have a programmer's manual to follow, which defines the ISA and the expectations of what instructions the CPU is supposed to accept and run. The ISA doesn't say, or rather it doesn't have to say, how fast it will run those instructions, but that it will run those instructions. I am being a bit vague when I keep saying instructions, but I don't want anyone to jump to any conclusions. This is because we need to acknowledge that there is a clear difference between the instructions the programmer enters and the instructions the CPU is executing. The ISA defines both these. For example, here on screen, you can see a photo generalizing the instruction format for x86 CPUs. Why is it important to cover both? Once again, this is good for both the designer and manufacturer of the CPUs, but also certain programmers. Even Intel, who doesn't want any new competitors, has to acknowledge that AMD is also legally allowed to make x86 CPUs as well, and it is good for both of them to keep their documentation up to date in order to verify that their stuff's matching. So if AMD makes a CPU and Intel is going to make a CPU in the same year and their documentation is up to date, then if any new instructions got introduced and maybe one of them's not going to, like, I don't know, have that instructions on that year, but for the next year, maybe they're going to also include that instruction, like Intel as a new instruction, and then AMD is going to adopt that the year later. They gotta keep referencing each other's manuals, because vice versa could also happen. Both of them could release new instructions at the same time, and so checking each other's manuals, they can verify. Okay, we agree that we are going to implement this, and if we implement this instruction, this is how it's got to behave. As far as the programmers are concerned, obviously they want to know how to program in assembly and how to do it right for whatever ISA they are targeting, but sometimes knowing the assembly is not enough. Some programmers aren't just coding in assembly, they're also coding their own compilers and assemblers. And when you're at that level, it's not just about knowing what the assembly instructions are supposed to look like and in what order they appear. It is also about knowing what machine code they're supposed to compile to. Let me tell you a fun fact about the RISC-V and MIPS ISA. Did you know that the assembly language for these two is almost practically identical. I haven't investigated too much, but whenever I compile the same C++ code and compare what the GCC compiler for MIPS and RISC-V spit out, I see the same mnemonics and register names. If you don't know what a mnemonic is, it's the names we use for the assembly language, like the names of the commands we use for the assembly language. We use OR to describe an OR operation. We use add I for add immediate, J for jump, and so on in both MIPS and RISC-V. If you're wondering why the GCC output for RISC-V and MIPS have different register names, they're not really different registers. The MIPS version is using the literal register number, and the RISC-V version is using the names that people would use in day-to-day talk. The actual instruction mnemonics and instruction formatting, however, is identical, at least as far as I can see, without further investigation. If I recall correctly, RISC-V does have some extra instructions and conveniences that MIPS doesn't have. For the sake of the argument, however, let's assume that MIPS and RISC-V are 100% identical when it comes to the assembly language. They have the same instruction mnemonics, the same instruction formatting, and the same amount of registers. But guess what? The machine code is different. That's right. You can have identical assembly code, but have different machine code. This has happened in the past, especially with older CPUs from the early 1980s and things like mainframes using different ISAs, where a system could be source code compatible down to the assembly level, but not at the machine code level. And therefore, you couldn't just take a binary executable from one platform and bring it over to another and hope it run. So anyways, when we say a pair of CPUs have the same ISA, we mean that they not only can compile or assemble the same code and you can expect the program to run on both CPUs, we also mean that they can run the same machine code or run the same binary or run the same executable. Alright, so now let's talk about RISC versus CISC. We know a little about what an ISA is and what are the expectations when we say the CPU from the Romulan Empire runs on the Warbird ISA. I will talk about another aspect of ISAs, specifically RISC versus CISC. There are a lot of foolish people trying to say things like ARM is the future or whatever because it's RISC. These people are fools because they're probably parroting whatever marketing they heard from Apple. So let's explain the foolishness. RISC stands for Reduced Instruction Set Computer. CISC stands for Complex Instruction Set Computer. Alright? The idea behind RISC is that you design an ISA with as few instructions as possible. These instructions are supposed to be simple as possible, but also avoid redundancy. For example, a RISC ISA might specify an add instruction, but not specify a subtract instruction. This is because if you need to subtract, you can just add a negative number. Usually an ISA will not go to this extreme, however. A more realistic example is that old CPUs used to not have actual hardware to do multiplication or division. Instead, they would do a combination of bit shifting and adding or subtracting in order to get the same result. Or alternatively, you may have something like a comparison instruction, such as a branch if greater than, where you would jump to another portion of the code if one register is greater than another, not be implemented in the actual ISA. And when you type that in your assembly code, it is actually a pseudo instruction, which means the assembler will convert that to two even simpler instructions. So if we have a branch if greater than instruction, I was trying to explain what that BGT does. That's what the mnemonic is, BGT. That instruction would get converted into two simpler instructions. This is what happens in MIPS. BGT is considered as the valid pseudo instruction by the assembler, but the CPU has no idea that such a thing even exists. It only sees SLT and BNE happen, which stands for set less than and branch if not equal respectively. And you can see here, I got picture up. Anyways, some of you might ask, why the heck would you intentionally put in less instruction? That sounds counterproductive. And honestly, I think you're right. This isn't a brainless decision, however. They bring up the reasoning that the average programmer shouldn't be programming in assembly and should only program in high-level languages. Instead, the only people who should be dealing with assembly are the people who are writing compilers for those high-level languages. This is ironic, however, because at the end of the day, someone has to write a compiler, and if the compiler is garbage because the available amount of instructions is minuscule, you basically reap what you sow, and there's nothing you can do about it other than try to write a better compiler somehow. Another reason the people who like RISC mention is that a RISC ISA helps ensure that the amount of chip area you'll need to make your CPU will be minimal, because there is going to be inherently less logic you'll have to implement at the hardware level. This is a bit silly, however, because we're not in the 1980s anymore, and we have plenty of room right now to implement whatever logic we want. Also, this is even sillier when you remember that most of the transistor count of a CPU at this point isn't even the CPU itself, but the cache memory that is bundled with the CPU. No amount of crippling your CPU is going to change the fact that most of the chip area is going to be dedicated to cache memory, unless you want to be even more barbaric and let go of cache altogether and limit yourself to just DRAM. But implementing less instructions and having the CPU stick with these very basic instructions, it means that it will inevitably have to do a lot of operations to do what an accelerator chip could do very quickly. In general, it encourages that people split the load up into multiple specialized chips. So if there's like, I don't know, the CPU is really slow at encryption, as cryptography. I remember that in my embedded systems class, there was this Texas Instruments Launchpad that had an ARM ISA, probably a cut down version of the ARM ISA, like one of the weaker architectures, because there's variants even within ARM. And if you wanted to do some cryptography, there was an accelerated dedicated to just that. And if you wanted to do memory operations, there was a accelerator for that at DMA, but that's kind of common, and so on and so forth. This is very backwards. The whole point of making a general purpose CPU was so that you centralize all operations onto one chip, not so that you would go back to having multiple chips, to making multiple chips and come up with different ways of communicating with all these chips and complicate the manufacturing, communication, and logic of the system as a whole. Because if you have those chips spread out across the board instead of like all in one place, you are increasing the latency and the communication between them. There's like stuff like you have to deal with like clock multipliers or whatever, or where you have like the chips that are far away from the CPU running at like 1/5 the clock speed of whatever's happening on the CPU, and this all sucks. Like even the cache memory that I previously mentioned, did you know the cache used to be separate from the CPU? And when during that time, the cache had to run at the same clock as regular RAM, so it wasn't really that great, but because it was still physically closer to the CPU, it wasn't as bad as reading from the RAM. But the point is, people eventually moved the RAM, the cache, inside the CPU, or not inside. They moved it closer. They put it on a cartridge. They put the CPU and cache on a cartridge type of thing. So for a short while, CPUs were in a cartridge format, and this way they were able to increase the cache clock speed to half that of the CPU, and eventually when the manufacturing got cheaper, they put the cache onto the CPU, and now it runs on the same clock speed, and of course it's now literally inside the CPU die, I guess you could say. And then because it's now both physically closer and because it has the same clock speed, it's way faster than it was before. If you revert and you start splitting up functionality into different places, well, guess what? You're gonna have problems. And I don't. We're getting off topic, anyways. Let's stick to the script. There's yet one more reason the people who will love RISC will try to convince you, and that is the actually no. Hold on. Let me ask something else. Like floating point operations, the floating point unit in the past, the early x86 chips, you would have uh, you would have a separate chip dedicated to do floating point operations, and there was its own assembly language and blah blah blah, and uh, eventually they said, you know what, forget it. We're going to integrate this into the CPU. The assembly language that you previously wrote for that floating point, the coprocessor was going to be, it's the same. It'll still be compatible, but now it's part of the CPU, and this helps once again improve the performance. But well, okay, now we'll get back to it. There is yet one more reason the people who love RISC will try to convince you with, and that is the idea that by having simple instructions, you can get more instructions done per CPU cycle. This is worthless to talk about. If those instructions do less work, but you're doing more of them, who cares? The metric we care about is how fast the job is done and how much power was required. Things like switching from single-threaded workloads to multi-threaded workloads contributes more to saving power and increasing speed in switching ISAs. That's just one innovation I'm trying to point out. It's like I'm trying to say the bigger innovations are the innovations in other fields is most likely what's going to contribute to improving speed, not these types of things. And you know what the best part is? A lot of this stuff I mentioned ends up not even mattering, even though RISC fanboys still use them as a talking point. I'll explain after I explain CISC. And yes, it's probably clear by now I'm very biased towards CISC and prefer it. Okay, so CISC means complex instruction set computer, as I said before. If I haven't or it hasn't, whatever. I'm saying it again. It just doesn't mean that there's complicated instructions involved, but also that the designers of the ISA are not afraid to add more instructions. As many as they please, or at least as many as they can handle and cram into the silicon. Alright, so CISC means complex instruction set computer. Means, whatever. One take. Because CISC means complex set instruction computer, as I said before. It just doesn't mean that there's complicated instructions involved, but also that the designers of the ISA are not afraid to add more instructions. As many as they please, or at least as many as they can handle and cram to the silicon. They will add whatever the hell they want, and they'll be happy. The designers of CISC want you to frolic in the abundance of instructions and tools you have available to you. A CISC CPU wants you to give the assembly language a try, or not even try, make whole games with it. It wants you to be as close to it as you would with your loved ones. CISC CPUs are the only CPUs where you could see specialized assemblers written for it, and even see people write whole games for it and be proud of their work. Turbo Assembly, for example, was an assembler developed and sold by Borland for MS-DOS PCs during the 1980s and early 1990s. Those PCs all had x86 CPUs in them. Though that may be unheard of today, it was completely unheard of, and is still unheard of course, when it comes to any RISC platform, and to this day, some people still sing praises of Turbo Assembly and the debugger you could use alongside it. Games like Roller Coaster Tycoon 1 and 2 were written entirely in x86 assembly. Wolfenstein 3D had a large part of its source code written in x86 assembly as well. Let's also not forget other CISC ISAs and systems. Did you know the Sega Genesis ran on a Motorola 68K? It was definitely not uncommon for games written for the Genesis to be written in the 68K assembly. Apple computers from 1983 to 1991 also ran on that same platform, the Motorola 68K. And well, Apple computers ran on x86 from 2005 to 2020. But anyways, some people might hear this and say, okay, who cares about that, dude? That's all in the past. We care about the present and future. I say to them, pop down, pop down. I will show you the present and the future as well. I will show you a whole 64-bit operating system written entirely in x86 assembly. Behold, Colibri OS. This is an operating system so lightweight, you only need 8 megabytes of RAM and a few megabytes free on your hard drive or SSD to run it. And yet it has a software renderer, it has a functioning web browser, a word processor, has an assembler, of course, for you to write your own games from the OS. Let's also not forget other operating systems like Temple OS, which of course needed a lot of good knowledge of x86 assembly to get built. And that was built mostly by one guy. Like, he has some other stuff, like the artwork, the sprite art were made by some other dude. He paid like $3,000 or whatever. Man, the hard work. He did all the hard work, you know what I'm saying? But I don't want to just talk about products and programs that were built for CISC-based systems. I need to cover the fundamentals as well, just as I did with RISC. So let's talk about them. Remember when I was proudly declaring how CISC features a lot of instructions? That's not just empty words, and it's not a gimmick either. When the Intel Pentium Pro and later x86 CPUs, with the Intel Pentium Pro and later x86 CPUs, we saw the introduction of MMX instructions. And MMX stands for Multimedia Extension. You can kind of guess by the title that MMX was important for things like watching movies and also probably important for playing 3D games. MMX instructions were the first of their kind. They were the first SIMD instructions, which stands for Single Instruction Multiple Data, where with a single instruction, you can send in multiple registers to the CPU at a time and have operations done on them. Like, you can send, multiple integers. Hopefully I said that and not multiple registers. Intel and AMD would keep pushing and making more variants of these SIMD instructions, such as with the 4 generations of SSE instructions and later AVX instructions. MMX was limited to dealing with 64 bits of data at a time, where you could, for example, deal with 2 32-bit integers at a time, 4 16-bit integers at a time, or 8 8-bit integers at a time. SSE, however, raised the bar to 128-bit, and AVX raised it to 256-bit. And there's even a special version of AVX called AVX 512, which you could send a whole 512 bits of data at a time to the CPU. Why these instructions are good for not just movies and games, but other things like scientific calculations? Well, they make matrix operations or vector operations happen very quickly. If you take in physics, you know that vectors have multiple components to them. If you've taken a few math classes, you also know matrices have a lot of components to them as well. So being able to deal with those individual components all at once can be a real time saver for you and the CPU itself. And you want to know something funny? You remember those so-called RISC CPUs? Well, ARM eventually started pushing their own variations on SIMD years after x86. It was introduced in 2002 at the earliest, with the first version of the so-called Neon instructions in ARM version 6, and they've slowly been adding to it. But it was pretty easy to find smartphones without certain SIMD instructions, causing people not being able to run the apps or games they wanted to run, such as right here with this Sky game. I haven't heard of it, but I found it on accident. This guy had a lower-end device, a Samsung Galaxy A10s. And he had no idea what any of this jargon means, and I don't blame him. The point is, where exactly do we draw the line at what's reduced, in quotation marks, and what's complex? To me, anything that has SIMD is a CISC ISA. If you're going to add in the logic and circuitry for SIMD on your CPU, don't be a coward and instead embrace CISC in its entirety. Not only that, ARM charges money depending on how much of the Neon instructions you want in your CPU design. there is also the flip side of some ARM devices being so stripped and bare bones that not even in the assembly level do they offer a division operation. There's some other stuff I'd like to mention regarding CISC devices, which is related to this. Generally speaking, a device with a CISC CPU, especially x86 CPUs, will not arbitrarily remove an instruction in one model just because it's lower end, unless the instruction in question is cutting edge for the time and is temporarily exclusive to the higher end models. Most of the time, all the instructions will be available, and if they're not, as I said, it'll only be the newest of the new instructions that aren't available. Not an instruction that's over 10 to 20 years old. What I'm referring to right now is AVX 512. That's the only specific subset of instructions in x86 that you shouldn't expect everywhere. But when it comes to anything currently produced right now or the past 5 years, you can expect all the other instructions to be available to you, regardless of if you're buying from AMD or Intel. That's why you can blindly just buy something new and expect that most of the instructions in the programmer's manual will be there. This is in stark contrast with ARM, where you can buy a device with an ARM CPU, and not only will you have to refer to the programmer's manual to know how to program it at the lower levels, you will also need to check the specific model's documentation. It's not even enough to check a general purpose generational manual if such a thing exists. You absolutely must check the documentation for the specific device. Because, besides the ISA of the CPU and like when that was made and all that, each of these devices tend to have their own quirks that for whatever reason, if you do this and you sleep on a full moon, then it's not going to work out right? I'll get to what I mean in more detail a bit later. Let's not dwell on this point for too long. Let's cover other areas. Semantics. The next thing I'd like to cover is semantics. This is related to where people say x86 isn't really CISC because it is a hardware component. It has a hardware component that converts the CISC instructions to RISC. Let's look at this monkey business here. There's this dude from the San Diego State University. He's got this slideshow, and he didn't convert it properly from PowerPoint to PDF. But anyways, the real mess up here is the argument that about how even x86 is actually RISC because the CPU internally converts the CISC operations to the so-called micro operations. Look, I don't care about what the CPU internally does. Like, this is like on so many layers of internally, almost everyone is completely oblivious to this. Okay? You're talking about a micro architectural feature, not an instruction set architecture feature, not an instruction set architecture issue, and it's not even micro architecture thing that like most people even remember exists. Like, they probably know about it if they're like super deep studying, but they don't care. Okay, that's the thing. They don't care. They don't need to care. As far as every user, programmer, hardware manufacturer, or whatever is concerned, x86 is CISC because down to the machine code level, they are observing CISC instructions, not RISC instructions. Any attempt to mess with this is futile. Don't try it. You'll hurt yourself in the process. Microarchitecture is not supposed to ever be touched by anyone other than designers of the CPU itself. That's kind of the point, And like, as you can see from this code, Terry Davis tried to force his own way of making his compiler use only RISC instructions. And not only did he get little to no speed up, in one of the cases it just made the code even slower. The moral of the story is, let the engineers at Intel and AMD take the wheel, and once again I state, be happy with the large choices of instructions you have. I think the only instructions you should ever avoid using in the gigantic x86 ISA is the legacy floating point unit instructions, the FPU instructions, since we have other ways of calculating floating point numbers and with greater precision and speed. However, considering that there are people out there who insist that using Java or Python is acceptable, and therefore making slow and crappy code is acceptable, feel free to use what you want. The justice or lack thereof has to be consistent. If we're going to allow slow code on the high level, fine. have slow code on the assembly level as well, because these people don't care about speed. They just care about being sloppy or whatever it is they care about. Maybe nothing at all. Um, and I don't think I wrote this, but I kind of want to get to it because, in case I forget right now. So earlier we covered about how the strength of RISC, the so-called strength of RISC, involved having the compiler designers make a really fast compiler. This is like the lamest argument ever, because with CISC it should actually be easier in some ways to make a fast compiler, because it's more like a high level language. And besides that, as we just mentioned, if you really wanted to butcher everything and reduce yourself to RISC instructions on an CISC ISA, you could, for one thing. There's even a compiler I know of. It's been several years, but I remember seeing it, where it'll take everything and try and turn it into an XOR operation, which is like, that's like super duper RISC, and they do that for obfuscation, code obfuscation. It'll probably make the code run terribly, or maybe it'll run fast. I've got no idea. I didn't check the performance. But the point is, any ISA you can go, well, if the compiler is done pretty fast, then it doesn't matter what's underneath, does it? Like, did you know Intel Itanium, which is it's apparently VLIW, very long instruction word. Apparently that doesn't count as CISC. That's like its own category. That's why I don't mention it too much in the script, but that's its own thing. Itanium was supposed to kill off x86, and it had like these super duper cool long instructions that do a lot of either small operations at once. Like one instruction does multiple small operations, kind of like what it's in this respect, maybe you can say it's a bit similar to the SIMD instructions, but let's not get into that. I don't want to make false comparisons on accident. The point is, these guys were like, well, it's, so long as we make a good compiler, then anything you write in C++ will be so fast it's going to beat x86 in performance. And apparently making a good compiler was basically the programmers of the era were not up to the task. Let's just put it at that. The programmers of the era were not up to the task, and Itanium was a failure because they banked on making fast compilers for it and hoping someone else would make fast compilers for it. You should not rely on that. That's the moral of the story, unless you plan on doing it yourself. If you come up with an ISA and you say the ISA is great, despite how complicated it is to program and assembly or whatever the potential complaint might be, like, this doesn't matter because it's gonna have a good compiler, and you actually deliver on a good compiler, then okay, fine. If you got a good compiler and you wrote it yourself and you got it ready and you're not relying on someone else, good. Then the arguments can be made. But if you're expecting other people to make the compiler for you, maybe take a walk. Take a walk, buddy. Anyways, let's get back to it. I'll address that issue. Okay. Now, there's another thing I want to talk about. Compatibility of all types. So this video got pretty long, and I started writing the script without writing a table of contents, so I forgot some of what I was going to say. Maybe. I don't think I forgot too much, but let's not drag it out too much longer. I'll mention one other thing that's pretty important, and it pretty much annihilates the conversation, but people tend to forget anyways, despite how obvious it is. It's compatibility. And I'm not talking about just a software compatibility, but also the hardware compatibility. The hardware is not directly an ISA issue, but is very closely related to it because there are inherent expectations and there's development surrounding. Nothing is developed in a bubble, right? Like nothing you make, nothing you do is developed in pure isolation. But let's start off with the software. If I haven't made it obvious yet, x86 CPUs understand the same language as the CPUs from the original 8086 from 1978, which is 46 years ago at this point. They understand the exact same machine code, as in you can run 8086 machine code on Intel i9 14900K or whatever, or Ryzen 5800, or shoot, I think it was, let's just say Ryzen 5800 X3D. I forgot what it is. Ryzen 7, Ryzen 9. Who cares? Ryzen 9 5950X. But don't expect those newer, the machine code of the newer CPUs to run on the original 8086. But let's get to the point. There's almost no other platform I know of that offers this level of compatibility other than perhaps the IBM Z series mainframes, which can run software from the IBM 360 series mainframes of the 1960s. And we're not talking about mainframes here, which are machines for large businesses, upper organizations, and government bodies. We're talking about consumer technology. And for consumer technology, x86, that's the longest respecter of tradition and legacy. ARM, which is supposed to be x86's competitor, and it was made in 1985, so it's not even a new ISA, but people keep pushing it for whatever reason. ARM can't offer this same level of backwards compatibility. There are a lot of implementations out there, and I've read, for example, that ARM version 8 can run ARM version 7 and ARM version 6 code, but at the same time, I've also read that ARM version 8 implementations can choose to eliminate 32-bit compatibility altogether, even at the hardware level. It's a bit confusing, and the information is sparse when I try to Google stuff about this. A lot of the information written was from like 10 years ago. I guess people simply don't care. That's definitely not a good sign. Anyways, here are a couple pictures I saw. Like, this is some wiki from Seneca College, and there's a screenshot from the Gen 2 forums I found. Like, and the Seneca College wiki article is saying, there's a sentence that said, right now in 2013, like it was stated like 2013 was the current year. Like, that's not a good sign. Anyways, we definitely know that as far as implementations go, both Apple and Google killed off 32-bit app support, and they are the two biggest supporters of ARM. This was regardless of whether the hardware supported it or not. They can at any time just declare 5 to 10 years from now, oh, the 64-bit software that's perfectly fine, time to kill it for no reason, because it lacks some software or feature that you probably don't care. Like, it lacks something that you probably don't care about, but we absolutely have to have it. Even if the program would have run fine, we're just going to kill it off. Artificially, basically killing it off. Microsoft is the only company that attempts to make up for this by having x86 emulation on Windows on ARM, both for 32-bit and 64-bit software. And to be fair, part of the reason why x86 is known for backwards compatibility is Microsoft made sure that Windows itself didn't break anything regarding backwards compatibility by changing how a certain operating system call behaved. Backwards compatibility has to be maintained both at the hardware and software level. However, even Linux distributions made for x86 tend to more likely be backwards compatible than Linux distributions made for other hardware platforms. There's a lot of not just old games out there, but important software that date back to even the 1980s that people expect to run in the modern age, and the x86 platform is willing to comply one way or another. Anyone can testify in this. I don't need to point out all the different software out there. Someone else can do that for you. But, if you want to ask me, I can technically run a Turbo Pascal on my Ryzen machine by installing FreeDOS and going through it like that, or installing Windows 10 32-bit edition and running it like that. I can run 20-year-old games like Star Trek Elite Force or, Half-Life 1 for one reason or another. You get the idea. Oh, and remember that software extends to the tools to make software in the first place. So that's why I mentioned Turbo Pascal. Old compilers do not need to be rewritten to work on new hardware, especially if you don't intend to use the newer features. The compilers would benefit from a rewrite, but it's not outright necessary. This is yet another comfort available for users and developers of the x86 ISA. The hardware compatibility is an underrated thing that I need to address, and yet I might be doing a poor job of explaining, so I'll stay brief. Did you know that Intel established the PCI standard and later, of course, PCIe, PCI Express? And it was IBM who directly and indirectly established the current modern motherboard form factors such as ATX, eATX, micro ATX, mini ATX, and so on. This goes back to their AT PCs from the early 1980s. The x86 PCs, which were developed as a collaboration between Microsoft, Intel, and IBM, standardized what type of hardware the person buying a PC should expect, at least on a conceptual level. There is an expectation of detachable storage with a bus such as IDE from the old days or SATA and M.2 for today's devices. Generally speaking, desktop PCs allow you to install your own hard disk drive or solid state drive. They allow you to install your own RAM. When you wanted extra things like sound, graphics, or network cards in the past, you would connect them through the ISA slots, and now you connect them in the PCIe slots. Even the power supplies we use have a general form factor that can fit in most cases, and they have a standard 24-pin connector that you connect to the motherboard. And when I say cases, I don't mean like a case, as in at certain events. I mean literally, the computer case, the thing that you put your parts in. The motherboard also features a standard BIOS, or these days a UEFI, that allow you to install whatever operating system you choose. And they provide certain behaviors for the OS to communicate to the hardware. So in the past, for example, MS-DOS would use BIOS interrupts in order to interact with the hardware. And I'm sure there's some modern analog that's happening even for Windows and Linux, where for some things they have to communicate with a UEFI. The BIOS can even be updated if it's necessary. The point I'm trying to bring across to you is that there is an expectation of being able to repair, modify, or upgrade your PC, and this aspect is related to the fact that a PC is expected to have an x86 CPU, which follows the definitions outlined in the x86 ISA. All of this stuff is pretty much unheard of when it comes to ARM-based devices. Usually, all the components are soldered, and even if you manage to add an upgrade of some sort, the process of the rest of the system recognizing the upgrade is a chore. We have had ARM CPUs for almost as long as x86 CPUs, and yet there is simply no analog. Some people might say this is not an ISA issue, this is something else, but I disagree. If it wasn't an ISA issue, then how come IBM's PowerPC based devices, which are much more obscure and unheard of, have a lot easier time adopting PC standards? Check out the Talos machines using Power9 CPUs. It's not entirely related to the ISA, of course, but in my opinion, it's at least partially related. It's kind of like a gut feeling. I'm pretty sure when they were designing the PowerPC Power9 variation, the Power10 variation, they were thinking we gotta have the same expectations like on x86 for people to adopt our machines. But yeah. Anyways, that's all I have to say. The point is, x86 is cool. CISC as a whole is cool. RISC is completely overrated and more trouble than it's worth. And ARM is the worst ISA ever. Okay, I don't completely mean RISC sucks, but I do mean it's overrated. Like, I had fun programming in MIPS, and I'm pretty sure programming with RISC V or PowerPC is fun too. But yeah, I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed this long video. This is probably close to an hour at this point. And if you have any questions, just put them in the comments and I'll answer them. If you truly did make it to this point, thank you for watching. And have a good day. I hope you keep learning.